Hey, it's Matt. I'm back with another transparent watercolor. This is an 18 by 24 inch transparent watercolor of orchids. And I got photo reference from this at a local orchid show that we have here in Lansing and from my own orchids. And it was a lot of fun to work on. In the end, it had, I think it had 22 orchids in the painting. And if you count every individual blossom, I think it was 34 little orchid flowers in here. And it was kind of a quandary how to get all these working on the page together. And so it took a long time to kind of design the overall look of things. And I did most of that in Photoshop. And then once I had the basic sketch done, I moved it over to the watercolor paper. And I started doing this one by doing all the circles in ink. And that may seem like an odd place to start, but I figured that if those ink circles went down poorly, that would ruin the painting in the end, so I'd be better getting that out of the way early in case there was a problem. And once I had that done, I went and I frisked it off the flowers and the circles that were in the area to put in the background. And then I started washing in the background in a series of 3 layers. So I had the initial lighter blue that I put down, and then hit that with the hairdryer, and then brought in the middle, slightly darker area that was going to be the next darkest blue section, and got that washed in. I did the initial passes with just a house painting brush, and then switched over to 1-inch flat as things got smaller. And once I had that done, I cleaned it up a little and hit that with the hairdryer. And then I went about putting in the darkest part of the blue to kind of unify all these circular shapes with these kind of background crescents and oval shapes. Once I had that done, I hit everything with the hairdryer and then started peeling all of the frisket off. I didn't frisket anything that wasn't going to be touched by that initial background wash, because the frisket does affect the quality of the watercolor paper. It's better if you don't have to use it. So once that was peeled off, I went about painting each individual of these 22 little orchid specimens on the page. And you can see that the edges of these circles were pretty good with the circle and the pen and ink things, but I did end up having to go back and redo those with watercolor just to sharpen them up and make sure all the edges were really tidy. In doing this one, I did something I usually wouldn't do on a typical painting. That was what I just did one little section of it at a time. I think this works on something like this because you spent so long designing it ahead of time, and really it was about these isolated little vignettes that then come together as a whole in the end. So I did do them individually, whereas in a normal painting I'd kind of bring everything together as a whole and work a little here, work a little there. This one I was mostly preserving the paper to keep it super clean because there was so much going on this one that I just open up the section of the painting I was working on and keep the rest covered up so it wouldn't get dirty or any paint splattered on it. And so in some cases I worked on 2 of the little ones that were close to each other, since they were right there and they had similar colors. In designing this one, it took a long time to figure a composition that would work with all these different sizes and types of flowers. And what I tried to have in the end was a progression. I had like pinks moving to kind of these middle peachy colored orchids in the middle of the page, and then on the far right side of the page I went to kind of these yellow and orange orchids. With this gigantic one in the middle that was kind of crazy and had some of both the pinky tones and some of the kind of yellowy green tones in it. It's kind of a middle ground to unify things. And again, this is all transparent watercolor, so it was done with many different glazes of transparent paints. In some cases, like this one where it's a light pink, it goes pretty quickly. And other ones, if you've got a lot of spotting and dotting and crazy patterns, it can take a long time to get these rendered right and have them reading correctly. And it varied which brush I used. For some of the bigger parts, I'd use a number 6 round like I am here, and then as you got into the tiny details, you'd move down to a sharp number 2 brush, and then eventually down to 10-aughts and really tiny brushes. And for this guy in the middle, you kind of had to approach this one in a way that was, I wouldn't say counterintuitive, but you had to approach it in a very particular way because it was transparent watercolor. So on this one, I had to paint all the light tones and then get the whites and those light greens established. And then I was going to bring in the stripy colors that go on top of that later. If you did it in the other direction and you had the dark stuff going first in those stripes, it would end up getting muddy and you'd lose some of the sharpness as you put the wet, lighter colors in on top of those darker tones. So you can see here I'm starting to bring in all those reds, that those little veins that if I had those in earlier, those would want to move around a little. And so by establishing the other tones first, I ensure that I'm not going to make a big messy puddle out of the thing as I do it. And these patterns were so much fun to work on. They're just crazy. They had so many strange little webbing, reticulated patterns through it that were just really fun to paint. It was just something totally different. And I'm not really sure what orchid this one was. I didn't write down the name of it when I took the photo, so if you know what it is, leave a comment, because I don't know what it is. I'd love to know. So you can see right here I'm using a number 2 brush, and I'll switch to other smaller brushes here and there as I go through. But a lot of this was with 2s and 6 brushes. And just many, many, many layers glazed and glazed and glazed on top of each other to build the depth of the textures. So then I started working on these, moving toward with the kind of peachy one down at the bottom, moving toward the yellows and orangey versions of the orchids on the right side of the painting. And strangely, the reds and pinks always seem to go faster. The yellow's kind of a fussy thing to do in watercolor, and I don't exactly know why yellows can be, I don't want to say problematic, but they have a different set of painting challenges to them. And I think what it is that with the yellows, you got to keep your values really high, and you don't want to get too dark without losing some saturation, because the tendency is, to use some of these cooler colors as shadows, and I think that sometimes ends up graying it out a little if you're using purples or blues, and then it pushes it green or gray. So with these, I'd often use oranges and reds to kind of bring in those shadow areas, and that I think kept the look of the vivid yellows, and it had the right overall look without having a color swing in it that looked unrealistic. And I love painting reds. Reds are always fun because you can go from those warm oranges to the really cool alizarans and all the way to the purples. So it's always a blast to paint these. And this one was fun to do because it had all these kind of, yellows to, everything from lemon yellow to cadmium yellow medium and cadmium yellow light, moving to dioxazine, not dioxazine, but the chrome orange, and bringing cadmium reds and things like that. It was, they were fun to paint these. You can see I've switched to a, on some of these are really tiny little brushes, and just to get the little details on these guys, and the little lines and creases on these that make them so fascinating. You just need a fine little brush to get these little details down. And it looks so fast to see the paint going down now. This thing took a long time to get all painted, but it is kind of interesting to see it all just kind of shoot out and fast forward here, because it was probably, I don't know what the total hours were, but it was, a week and a half of work on this thing at least. This one you're seeing kind of sideways at the moment, just by the way the camera's at. And because this was in the upper right-hand corner of the painting, I needed to get it closer to myself to get the detail in. So I moved it close to myself so the camera had the funny view. There you go. That makes more sense. So this was the last part of the painting. This was the far right series of little orchids that were in this neat little bract coming down. And I don't know whether it was because these were the last ones of the painting, or I had to kind of step away from this painting for a week or two, and maybe that was why these ones seemed to take so long. But I don't know, the last group of flowers on this just seemed to take forever to get done. But they're really pretty. So there you go. That's an 18 by 24 transparent watercolor of a bunch of different orchid varieties. Well, thanks for watching. If you get a chance, have a peek at the blog or leave a comment.